We continue our focus on discipleship today as we consider the famous words of the Old Testament prophet and poet known as Micah. The prophet Micah is ancient and important enough that he's got his own book in the Old Testament. Micah was also part of the same tradition that Jesus walked, that Jesus followed during his earthly years. And we don't usually think of Jesus following anyone other than God, but that's not really the case. Jesus didn't suddenly appear out of nowhere. Jesus followed or was part of an ongoing tradition, the Jewish tradition, but more specifically important to us today, Jesus was part of the Jewish prophetic tradition, just like Micah. As followers of Jesus, Jesus is our example, and so it's important for us to know and to understand what Jesus himself followed here on earth. Jesus had a lot of choices. Jesus could have followed or joined the temple priests, for example, known as the Sadducees. The Sadducees were important priests who ran the temple, and they felt, and they were sure that they represented God's will more so than anyone else. Sadducees believed that temple worship was the highest commandment from God and that could only be done in Jerusalem. The Sadducees could be seen as the religious conservatives of that time period. But Jesus didn't follow them. Jesus never became a Sadducee. Another popular religious group of time were the Pharisees. The Pharisees believed that God could be worshiped anywhere, even outside the temple, through following the law. To the Pharisees, worship consisted not only of blood sacrifices, which they practiced, or they took part in, which was really the practice of the Sadducee priests, but also in prayer and their study and implementation of God's law. And the Pharisees saw far more value in the tradition and writings of the prophets than the Sadducees did, who focused primarily on those first 5 books of Moses. So the Pharisees could be seen as the religious liberals of that time period. Jesus did not follow them either. Jesus never became a Pharisee. Now, there were also zealots. They were religious extremists who were dedicated to the violent overthrow of Rome. Jesus did not follow them either, although many believed that he was, but that was the plan. But no. And there's other options too. I'm not going to cover them because for Jesus, apparently, there was really just one option, and that was the prophetic tradition. Jesus started his ministry there in the prophetic tradition when he approached John the Baptist in the River Jordan. In doing so, Jesus attached himself to that movement. In doing so, Jesus was identifying directly with the ancient Jewish prophetic tradition. The prophetic tradition might be the hardest to understand, in part because it fell in and out of favor over the years, and more often than not, it was out of favor. The prophetic tradition in Jesus' time was a tradition of spiritual outsiders, kind of like modern street preachers. The world is coming to an end. That's kind of the way that prophets were looked at, the way we would sort of see that kind of activity. Prophets were usually unofficial and often marginalized individuals who claimed they had a message from God that the other religious institutions could not, for one reason or another, deliver. The conservative and liberal authorities were well respected. They lived in nice homes, and they acted in socially and culturally appropriate ways. The prophets, no, they were more like John the Baptist, outsiders, voices crying out in the wilderness, usually ignored and sometimes killed because of the unacceptable nature of their message. It's hard to know if someone was a true prophet or if they were suffering from mental illness, or in biblical times, if they were infected by an unclean spirit. When we agree to follow Jesus, we're often unaware of this historical reality that we are following a tradition that has often been marginalized, rejected by the good people of the community, and often seen as a little bit crazy. But while most prophets in Jesus' day were outsiders, that wasn't always the case. Sometimes they were in and out of favor. Sometimes leaders would listen or learn to rely on an outsider prophet way more than they would rely on the official temple priests. This was ancient history by the time Jesus arrived in Jerusalem. The great prophet Micah, who we heard today, likely lived 700 years earlier. And each of these groups, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Zealots, and the prophets, they all had the same purpose. They all had the same desire at heart, the desire to discern and do God's will. The Sadducees were quite sure they were the ones doing God's will, and that they were the final word on Jewish tradition because the temple sacrifices had been commanded by God directly through Moses. Of course, the Pharisees believed they were doing God's will. And while they took part in temple worship, the Pharisees were also far more open to spiritual practices outside the temple. And the Pharisees believed that there was such a thing as the kingdom of heaven. The Sadducees saw all that as nonsense. The Sadducees and the Pharisees spoke for the middle class and for the wealthy. Who did the prophets speak for? The poor. While the prophets usually had no official role, God would frequently use a prophet to intervene when the other religious authorities got it all wrong and a new vision was needed, usually when the poor were being mistreated. The conservative and liberal religious authorities, for example, typically would predict that Israel would win any battle or any war they were involved in based on their understanding of God's will for the Jewish people. How could God's people be defeated in battle? I mean, give me a break. That's impossible, right? And that was the normal message. Predicting a military defeat was something no respectable religious authority would even consider until it was really obvious, until it was too late, until troops were massing at the border. Prophets, on the other hand, would risk death by doing just that, by predicting destruction and defeat. And this took a lot of courage. This was not for the faint of heart. If you wanted to be a prophet, it took a lot of courage, or maybe more accurately, a lot of prodding by God. Prophets were not popular people. They were the ones who delivered the tough news from God that people did not want to hear. And sometimes prophets would speak up with a tough message from God at a time when things were good, when most people, at least from a leadership perspective, felt like things were going really well, when the nation was prosperous and not under threat of attack, when everything seemed right and good to God's people. Up would pop a prophet. In Micah's time, some 700 years before Christ's birth, things were going really well. There were no foreign armies massing at the border. The leaders of Israel had made deals with the powers around. People were living really well. All the correct sacrifices were being done at the temple. Things were not right, though, in the eyes of God. In the book of Micah, Micah laments that how the powerful keep desiring more land. They're taking advantage of their power to seize land from the poor, driving women and children out of their houses and using up all of God's patience in the process. Micah's message describes how the people were doing well, most of the people, but still selfishly they wanted more. So much so that they were acting wickedly to the point that they, in Micah's poetic words, were tearing the skin off of the people, were chopping them up like meat in a kettle. That's how prophets talk. That's how they deliver their message. They were doing violence to the poor, while their priests and rulers took bribes to look the other way. Even in really good times, who suffers the most? The poor, the overlooked, the rejected. Good times had resulted in a big gap between the rich and the poor. The rich were doing great, and the poor were struggling to get enough to feed their families. The rich and powerful in the community were putting a lot of effort into making sure that the practices of the temple were perfect, executed to a T. But at the same time, they're ignoring the poor or exploiting them to the point of great suffering. Micah is a prophet and a poet, and so he writes a poem to convey his message. A poem that describes a long-suffering God who remains faithful to a people who have forgotten what it means to love neighbor, who have forgotten what it means to care for those in need, imploring them that they need to do better. It kind of reads like a series of speeches, but there's another interesting aspect of the book of Micah that can get lost if we're not paying attention. Particularly in the original Hebrew text, these speeches are written within the context of a court legal proceeding, a trial. The prophet Micah describes a trial where Israel is the defendant and God is the plaintiff. God has got a complaint against the people despite the fact that the people have been faithfully following all the prescribed temple practices that Moses had laid out. Perfectly, by the way. But God brings a covenant lawsuit against the people. In Micah's words, the people have broken their covenant with God, and God seeks a remedy. In this courtroom, the narrator, Micah, speaks first at the start of Micah chapter 6. He says, "Rise, plead your case. The judge and jury are the mountains and the hills and the foundation of the earth." Micah says, the Lord has a controversy with his people. And then God lists off all the good things that God had done in the past for Israel. And God asks why Israel is treating God so poorly. Now, remember that God identifies with the poor, with the weak. And so in the prophetic tradition, the poor and the weak, treating the poor and the weak badly equates to treating God's badly, at least in Micah's poem and in the prophetic tradition as a whole. Then the nation of Israel speaks as if one person in response to God, and they're not getting it. The people ignore God's concern for the poor, and instead they focus on acts of worship. Focused on temple rituals, the people ask, what more do you want, God? I mean, come on. Is it enough that I come before you and bow? Or do I need to bring a burnt offering with a calf for sacrifice? Or do I need to bring 1,000 rams and 10,000 rivers of oil? The people are kind of getting ridiculous here. Of course, in no situation did God in the Old Testament ever suggest 1,000 rams for sacrifice. The people are going way overboard in their self-righteousness, suggesting that maybe they should give God their firstborn for their transgressions. And kind of suggesting from their tone that God won't even be satisfied. God, you're not going to be satisfied if we give you our firstborn. And by the way, child sacrifice specifically outlawed in the Old Testament, yet there's record of it happening in Micah's time. Sometimes in really dire situations, 700 years before Christ, the people of Israel had resorted to that. But in saying this, the people are making the point that they are openly skeptical that anything could please God. I mean, look at our temple practices. I mean, come on, God. Get with the program. And so in this case, God versus the people of Israel, it's clear that the people are not getting it. God is unhappy with how the people are treating the poor, the hungry, the prisoners, the powerless, and yet all the people keep offering up in response is more ritualistic offerings. And so this is where Micah comes back into the conversation in the courtroom, and he says, no, come on already. Or more precisely, he says, he has told you mortals what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? It's kind of the verdict of the trial. The message that Micah delivers to the people. Micah presents us with a universal rule good for all people in all time. There is no ritual or symbol of sacrifice inside the temple that is going to please God if outside the temple we're not willing to seek justice for all, particularly the poor. Taking advantage of those in need comes from a failure to do justice. Failing to take care of the poor is a failure to love kindness, and it's a failure to walk humbly with God. Worship practices are supposed to be a reflection of the self-giving sacrifice required to treat our neighbors, particularly the ones that might otherwise be left out or left behind, with love. If we're willing to sacrifice everything inside the temple, but outside the temple we're unwilling to act to reduce the suffering of our neighbors, then our sacrifice in church, in temple, is worthless to God. That is Micah's message. The people of Micah's time were very religious, but their idea of what religion meant was far from God's plan for them. They thought religion consisted of worshiping correctly and staying away from those who did not. They did not take their religion outside into the public square in ways that represented God's plan for humanity, in ways that reflect sacrifice in more meaningful ways, or in ways that reflect that they were walking humbly with God on a day-to-day, a step-by-step basis. Walking humbly with God does not mean being humbled just with God. To walk humbly with God suggests an attitude of reverence and openness, along with a sense of personal integrity, authenticity, and gentleness. Walking humbly with God does not mean just being humble with people more powerful than we are. It's about being humble with the poor, with the people that we risk seeing as less than ourselves. In modern times, we too can get all wrapped up in thinking about what constitutes proper worship to the point of overlooking what it means to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God. In modern times, we respectable Christians can still tend to worry too much about our beliefs and not enough about pursuing justice for the poor and the powerless. Specifically, like in ancient times, we tend to focus more on whether our beliefs will ensure our own salvation, rather than whether our beliefs will result in justice for the poor and the powerless. The message of Micah is there to remind us what's at the heart of it all. That burnt offerings and all the other ceremonial stuff are just the window dressing of worship. They aren't the point. Micah clearly and firmly reminds us that God has told us what is good and what is required. No matter our worship practices, no matter our beliefs, we are to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly. And in that tradition, Jesus teaches a belief system where hearts can't help but to weep at the sight or the sound or the smell of the kinds of injustice that cause unnecessary suffering in the world. As followers of Christ, I hope we can see why Jesus chose the Jewish prophetic tradition to identify with. As we walk our path of discipleship today, Jesus reminds us what's at the heart of it all, just as Micah did. That it's not just about what we say or do inside the church. It's not just about our beliefs. Not that beliefs aren't important. It's that we live with God's deep and abiding love in our hearts, and how that love pours out from us into the world, particularly to those in need. Or as Jesus put it in Matthew 22, the most important thing is to love God with all our hearts and love our neighbor as ourselves.